Okay. Good morning. My name is Mona Ataya. I am the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies here at the George Washington University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Elliott School of International Affairs for this event on transnational justice in Syria, an opportunity for progress. We're absolutely delighted to have this event be co-sponsored with the New Lines Institute Middle East Center and Huquqiyat, a Syrian civil society organization founded by women lawyers and legal practitioners. I'd just like to thank the IMIS Assistant Director, Christian Clinton, the New Lines Institute, Nicholas Aris, Senior Director for Strategy and Programs Unit in the Academic Division, and Sultan El Ahmed, Resident Senior Fellow at the New Lines Institute Middle East Center, of their support today. Today's panel discusses the challenges and opportunities for transnational justice in post-Assad Syria. I'd like to welcome our moderator, Denia El-Rayesi, who's a non-resident senior fellow in the Middle East Center at New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. Thanks so much, Denia.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this important conversations on transitional justice in Syria and opportunity for progress. My name is Dania El-Rayesi, and I am a non-resident senior fellow at the New Lines Institute. I'm also a PhD candidate at the CU Boulder Department of Political Science. My work focuses on civil society organizations, individual political attitudes, political behavior, political economy in the MENA region. And I'm honored to moderate this discussion today with excellent scholars and policy practitioners on transitional justice in Syria. Over the next hour, we'll explore how justice can be pursued beyond traditional frameworks through three major concepts: survivor-centered investigations, corporate accountability mechanism, international advocacy, and comparative transitional justice process. At the heart of this panel is a recognition that justice is not a singular path, but a collective process that must include feminist, grassroots, and cross-sectoral approaches, signaling the importance of inclusive transitional justice approach, ensuring that survivors and affected communities play a central role in shaping and designing objectives and implementations of transitional justice process. Our panelists bring exceptional expertise to the discussion, grounded in legal practice, policy advocacy, and lived experience from Syria, the US, and Colombia. Together, they challenge us to rethink who is justice for, who delivers it, and how we build more inclusive, survivor-centered system of accountability. With that, I'm pleased to start the panel today with our first speaker, Mariana. Thank you for being here. Mariana is the co-founder and the investigation program director at Huquqiyat. Mariana will kick off the panel with an overview of Huquqiyat's survivor-led feminist approach to documenting war crimes in Syria. Her interventions will frame transitional justice as a tool for transformation, not just retributions, highlighting the role of gender-sensitive methodology and the ethical imperatives of working with survivors in the absence of state-led mechanism. So Mariana, thanks for being here. I would like to start the conversation today with can you tell us more about Huquqiyat as the feminist civil society organization in Syria? What role have you played in war crimes investigations? Can you just tell us more about the challenges that establishing a feminist civil society organizations have you encountered in this approach?
Thank you very much, Dania, and thank you also for New Lines Institute for this opportunity to speak about our work. I'm very, very, very glad and honored to be with you together from Huquqiyat today to speak about our work. Maybe a bit of background, the reason behind establishing the organization. At the time, it was 2020. I was getting some trainings together with a colleague who then became a co-founder of Huquqiyat, Layla Sibahi, on how to investigate international crimes. And there were a lot of questions on what are the gaps that we see at the moment in case building? What are the gaps that we see at the moment with survivors demanding to be on the table while cases are being built, looking at cases in a way that can also reflect where the harm and how the harm was conducted against certain communities. And this is where the gendered landscape to be, but also who is building those cases, who is working on them, and what is the strategy behind that. At the time, there were wonderful and amazing Syrian lawyers who were doing a lot of work to build cases in relation to international court crimes in the absence of any legal framework in Syria or any possibility at all at the time. This is something so different that we see today, hopefully, in the country. But at the time, there was no possibility to build any case in Syria. There was no possibility to open any case in Syria. There was no legal framework, no political will, and the crimes and violations were ongoing. They were committed. And then wonderful, amazing Syrian lawyers started looking at different angles on how can we look at these cases. We can use the universal jurisdiction, a legal tool that allows us in different European countries and other non-European countries as well to investigate international court crimes, to submit cases in relation to them. But then what is the end effect of that? What is going to happen after this case is submitted? How is it going to affect the harm that is conducted in Syria at the moment? Can we go to the International Court of Justice? Can we go to the International Criminal Court? No, we cannot. Why? All of these questions started rising up, and a lot of effort has been put on people who were on the panel today. But then there was a lack of gendered understanding of this crime. When we say gendered understanding, we don't only mean the women experiences that were happening while the crime was conducted, but we also mean the intersectional experiences that were occurring. We were looking at the siege of the south of Damascus, particularly at Yarmouk. We realized that those people who remain in areas that are besieged are less economically established. Most of the effects that happen to women are mostly underrepresented or overlooked. Women has been used as weapons of war by the Assad regime and by different militias in the country, and the experience they had were different as well, and they were never highlighted. And that was a moment where we said, oh, we want to look at case building in a strategic way, in an interventionist way that can allow us to look at laws applied on women prior to the harm conducted. Why can't women have freedom of movement in a siege context when they want to leave the country? Because there is a law in Syria that does not allow them to freely move from one place to another. Why women in siege have problems with pregnancy, but also with breastfeeding. Those are particular effects that women undergo. Doesn't mean that other members of the community do not, but this was the angle of it. And then we realized that there is a lack of women legal practitioners being part and taking active part in this case building. This was, again, I do not want to say intentional because this is big, but I would just want to say there was a lack of recognition of the value that those women can bring to the table. This was the idea of Huqiyya. It was bringing us, all of us together, trying to create a space that reflects on our criticism towards different spaces that we saw, we learned from as well, and trying to learn together on how to work in serving our communities, be it in case building through investigation, be it in research through knowledge production, and be it in pro bono legal aid for women inside the country as well, a service that we realized is lacking. A lot of women were getting workshops and trainings into the laws that oppress them, but this wasn't like, what happens next? I want a lawyer who can defend my case, who can go with me to court. But this was not possible. So this was basically the idea of Huqiyya, trying to create this membership-based space, bringing us together and trying to serve our communities in different ways. And then maybe later we can talk about the survivor-centric approach and the kind of gendered lens and how we came to define these concepts that seem very important at first glance, but then one needs to kind of delve into them and really define them into practice, right, and then what it meant to us.
I really appreciate explaining the gender component of transitional justice because we often have those conversations about having a gender component in transitional justice, but we don't have a clear understanding, description of those concepts. And so highlighting that it's not only limited for women, and it's really kind of comprehensive. I think this is an important part of this conversation. And then this conversation brings me to my second question for you, more like a technical understanding here. What is really survivor-centered model? What is that actually in a practice when we say transitional justice? And then we talk about survivor-centered model. What does that actually looks like in practice, but not only in theory? If you can explain more from your expertise on that topic and your work.
Absolutely. I think just to begin with, for us, also with Huquqiyat, it's a learning by doing process, and it has been as such since we started. We don't claim that we know it all, and we don't claim that we have the perfect way and method to create a survivor-centered methodology in case building. But where we started from is to realize that for us to have a survivor-centered approach, we need to talk to survivors and ask them what are the experiences they were having while being interviewed for certain investigations, their testimonies being taken. What are the challenges that they were facing? What was the role that they were playing in these cases? And what we heard reportedly was they felt that they were passive actors, that basically they would be interviewed. They don't know what is the legal framework that is used for the interview. Where is it going to go? What is going to happen with it? What is a consent? What does an informed consent mean? What does a continuous consent, informed consent mean, especially when Assad regime is still in power, especially when a lot of survivors and victims have their families still in Syria, which was also a very challenging period security-wise. What does it mean for a person to repeat the traumatic event that occurred to them again and again and again? This was the witness fatigue that we've heard reportedly being talked to us. What does this person need? They need psychological support. We need as civil more so that we don't have to put the person under the same pressure multiple times. Those were all reflections that we started making, and we started then developing practice that is surrounded around survivor-centered approaches. So we said in every case that we're going to start building, we're going to conduct a community forum. Within this community forum, we're going to make sure that people, the space where the community forum is conducted is there's a good risk planning for this space. There is a good accessibility for this space, because for a lot of people as well, especially not only residing in Europe, there were people residing in Turkey, there were people still inside Syria, which also creates different accessibility to justice efforts from those different places. We're going to sit with survivors and victims that we can reach out to, understanding the limitations, and ask, at first introduce what are the legal frameworks that are out there, ask what do you want us to prioritize? Where is the narrative? And the Assad regime was playing with the narrative so much that huge crimes that were committed against Syrians where there was a kind of a narrative created by the Assad regime to show that this crime was not committed against them. And this was an important aspect as well. What are the underrepresented crimes that they were seeing? How would we go about the case? And then this kind of partnerships goes from the beginning of the case building until the last moment of us submitting the case, but also finding the lawyers that represent the survivors and victims at court if the case went to court, and then providing them with psychosocial support that is also very needed and that is also overlooked in a lot of practices. And I think this has been somewhat the model that we try to build around what we define as survivors.
Thank you for this answer. I think this is a very important answer. Also leads me to another question. We know from the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, that there has been multiple than one actors involved in those crimes, right? We have under this big, gigantic dictatorships, we had multiple than one actors involved. And so I'm curious to learn from you about how really the work has been when you're working with multiple than one actors involved in those crimes, right? And so it's a gigantic system, right, of dictators, the regimes, it's different actors, the military, the police, the people on the ground, the community, right, were also kind of doing all these practices, like the violations, right, and the abuses. So how has your work been when you're working with multiple actors who have suffered from multiple, right, type of violation from different people?
You're absolutely right there. You have state actors, you have non-state actors, and then you have foreign actors. You have different militias who are also working as the long arms of the regime. You have non-state actors in different areas in Syria that were not under the regime controlling. You do speak to survivors who survived crimes that were committed against them in a detention facility. They were moved to another detention facility. They were freed from the detention facility, that there would be a crime committed against them from another non-state actor. So there would be this kind of series of crimes. And the question is, how do you document? Why are you documenting? Are you conducting the documentation just for the sake of documentation, or are you supporting the person in actually taking the case forward? The challenges that become, who are you working with? A lot of prosecution authorities in Europe at a certain moment were very interested in looking at ISIS-related cases. Because a lot of ISIS members were residing in some European countries, but B, because of the lack of political will when it comes to there is a kind of continuous, there is an understanding that yes, we want to go against them. And then to go against the Assad regime, it took a lot of energy, advocacy, and power from a lot of Syrian lawyers to say there were also crimes committed in detention facilities. They're still being committed. For us to acknowledge that they need to stop, we need to look at these cases. And I think this is a challenge when it comes to a survivor-centric approach, because you cannot always provide the person who is giving you their testimony, they're telling you, this is the trauma, this is what happened to me, to provide them with the best legal pathways, because we don't have control over that as a civil society.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mariana, for this great answers and backgrounds on those questions. I want to shift some gear, and we need to discuss more the concept of corporate accountability as part of our conversations today. And on this concept, we have Noor Ahmedi, also from Help Yes. Thank you for being here, Noor. Noor will help us understand more about corporate accountability, and Noor examine how corporations really have played role in fueling and profiting from the Syrian conflicts, and why corporate accountability must be a critical component of any transitional justice. Noor has extensive experience at the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable and the Syrian Legal Development Program. She will explore tools like mandatory human rights, sanctions enforcement, cross-border litigations as a mechanism to address harm and deter future abuse. And so I want to start more with questions about corporate accountability in a conflict settings. Can you help us understand what does that mean in an actual theory, but also practice, just so we can have a broader understanding about those concepts?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Dania, for the question. I guess maybe to start, I want to take a step back to think about the role that corporations or corporate actors play in conflict. Often when we think about conflict, parties to a conflict, or perpetrators of international crimes, we think of armed groups or we think of state actors. We don't think of the role that the private sector plays, but they play a really significant role. They're behind the financing of different war crimes, sometimes even direct perpetrators of crimes. They're behind every chemical weapons supply chain. Thinking about how the chemicals necessary to develop chemical weapons make it to somewhere like Syria. So corporations play a really significant role in conflict, and I think it's one that is really understudied and under-reviewed, and they're able to kind of get under the radar as compared to state actors. So when we look at international legal frameworks, they do contemplate kind of what the role of corporations looks like. So for example, in the law of war, international humanitarian law, there is a guide that looks to kind of when a corporation turns from sort of a civilian entity into a non-state actor, a member party to the conflict. The UN developed guiding principles on business and human rights in 2011 that dictate what the role that corporations play in protecting and respecting human rights throughout their supply chains. The UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, as well as UNDP, the UN Development Program, have both published guides on how states should be conducting heightened human rights due diligence in the context when they're operating in the context of a conflict. And then turning more specifically to the topic of today, which is kind of international criminal law and the role that corporations play. Now, international criminal law only applies to individuals and not to entities. And so often corporations have been held accountable in the context of international criminal law through sort of CEOs and employees of corporations, although senior high-level ones. So there have been multiple in previous conflicts, war crimes prosecutions that have occurred against corporate actors. There are examples ranging from the genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia to World War II. In Rwanda, one of the most notorious cases was a case against a radio presenter at a radio station that was inciting genocide and was a big pull towards basically the genocide starting. And that was a case under the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. The Nuremberg tribunals involved a case against a German company in World War II, or I guess against a business owner in World War II for financing the SS. His name was Frederick Flick. he was part of a group of companies called the Friends of Himmler, who and it was found that who were all donating to the SS, and it was found that he donated 10% of the money that went to them, which is a really significant amount, and that was the basis for his prosecution and complicity in those crimes. So those are a couple of examples. One of the more kind of recent examples, and I know we'll be hearing from Anna about Colombia, but one of the more recent examples is Chiquita Banana, which is an American banana company. They were during the Civil War in Colombia, they funded the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, the AUC, to basically protect their banana farms, to serve as security forces for their banana farms. And as a result, they paid really significant amounts of money to and were found. This is a case that has been ongoing in US courts for like 30 years now. But I believe just about a year ago, they were found liable for, I believe, 37 or 38 million dollars to the families of the victims of the AUC. So this is a really significant case, and I think sets a precedent for holding not just state perpetrators or non-state armed actors accountable, but also companies for financing those non-state armed actors as well. So I guess to answer your question, in terms of what kind of corporate behavior we're concerned with, I think the primary role that corporations have played is in financing conflicts, but also one thing that falls under the category of like the role that corporations can play is sort of war profiteering. Another example is companies that serve the role of sort of private security companies. Those in the context of a conflict can become direct members to the conflict because the division between security and armed actor in the context of a conflict can really be mixed. So those are a few examples, and that's some of these are examples we saw in Syria.
Can you elaborate more on those examples on Syria? Like give us more like maybe, because I know you've done a lot of research and a lot of work on corporate accountability in Syria. What does that look like? Practices. So it would be helpful to learn more from you about what has exactly happened in Syria when it comes to corporate accountability, who profited, who really kind of fueled this kind of actions. That would be helpful to know.
Yeah, so in the context of Syria specifically, I think it's important to differentiate between Syrian companies and international and foreign companies. So starting with Syrian companies, because I think they played a bigger role, I think maybe one thing to start with is taking a step back prior to 2011. The Syrian businesses, so basically the way that the economic style of Syria operated was basically a form of crony capitalism, where a small group of business people who are part of a close circle with the Assad regime, basically led the economy, controlled the entire economy. It was, again, a small circle of businessmen who basically monopolized absolutely every single industry in Syria. Other businesses had no room to compete. It completely destroyed kind of the private sector outside of just these small companies. If other businesses were profiting or succeeding, they were targeted. And so that's kind of, and so even prior to 2011, the private sector and sort of economic elites really uplifted the Assad regime and allowed them to continue to operate and served as another arm to the state, sort of. And so, yeah, that's kind of the background to that. But in the context of the conflict, these companies obviously still stayed very close to the Assad regime, but they also played a role in the conflict. And I'll list maybe 5 primary roles of how they do that. So I guess, yeah, maybe before I get to that, one thing I wanted to give an example of sort of the most notorious example of this. This is a well-known name in Syrian households, is Rami Makhlouf, who is Bashar al-Assad's cousin. He was sort of the primary holder of businesses in the Syrian economy. I think at one point he controlled about 60% of the Syrian economy, which is extremely significant. Yeah, I think that just goes to show kind of how significant of control they played and how closely tied all of this was. But yeah, like I said, turning to the last 15 years, I think with Syrian businesses, I'll highlight kind of 5 ways that they've been involved in the conflict. The first is financing direct perpetration of crimes. Many of these business people developed pro-Assad militias that they funded to basically be involved in the war effort to support Bashar al-Assad. And so they're in that way, they're not just complicit in crimes, they're sort of directly perpetrating those crimes. A second example is war profiteering. Following the destruction of neighborhoods and Syrians' homes, they also developed companies that would basically pillage scrap metal and other materials from destroyed homes and sell them as parts or kind of mold the metal into something else and sell that for construction of new homes or something like that. There was also one example of, I believe this was during the siege of Buta, where there was one grocery store salesman or vegetable salesman who was allowed to enter Buta at highly inflated prices. And so that was another way where kind of taking advantage of the siege situation and the starvation to make additional profits. And that was the only person I believe that was allowed in. That was the only way that people could buy groceries or anything like that. One example that I mentioned earlier is the private security companies. This is another way that many businesses profited, is that some of these businessmen developed private military and security companies that were contracted by the Assad government, were contracted by UN agencies. And that was a way that they were able further to fuel the profit making, but also, again, the line between security and armed actors sort of blurred in a context like this. Another example I'll give is sort of reconstruction. And I'm putting quotes around this because I believe in 2018, the government kind of announced a project that they were working on called Marota City, which was meant to be a reconstruction project. It was the first step toward redeveloping the country, or at least redeveloping parts of Damascus. But upon closer examination, what really comes out is that it was another form of oppression against Syrians. So essentially, this was a neighborhood where the intention was to basically demolish existing homes that people were already living in and then reconstruct them into luxury high-rises that only sort of Syrian elites and wealthy foreigners would be able to benefit from. And tenants who were living there got no compensation, had to figure out alternatives. Owners of homes got very minimal compensation, or were going to be getting very minimal compensation for their homes. The project kind of ended up kind of dying as a result of sanctions under the Caesar Act. But that was one way where the companies that were involved in that were ones that were already very close to the Assad regime, and they were getting government contracts to develop this luxury city. So this was another example. Another example that I won't go into too much detail about, because to be honest, I don't know much about it, was the Captagon trade. That was obviously, aside from just human rights abuses, was another way that sort of the government was able to finance its conflict. And then the last example I'll give is control and redistribution of humanitarian aid. So the Assad regime kept a very close watch on humanitarian aid, and all humanitarian aid going into Syria, or at least regime-controlled areas, had to go through humanitarian NGOs that were led by Asma al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's wife, and Rami Makhlouf. And often they would charge kind of high overhead to basically steal some of the money for themselves. But then also sometimes they would literally take the physical aid and redistribute it elsewhere, or take it and then sell it elsewhere. So it was literal theft of like physical aid, but then also theft of funds going towards aid through, for example, the Four Seasons Hotel is sort of the most luxurious hotel in Damascus. It's also owned partially by the Syrian government, as well as Samir Fous, one of the businessmen who was very close to the Assad regime. And all UN staff were required to live in the Four Seasons Hotel at inflated prices. Another way that they were sort of taking money focused at aid to support the government and the war effort. And so this was a really significant problem, has resulted in a lot of mistrust of UN agencies in Syria. And just to move to sort of foreign and international businesses, the role is a little bit more limited, just because I think for the last 15 years, Syria has been very isolated from sort of the rest of the world. But One example I'll give is of Lafarge, which is a Swiss cement company. They started operations in Syria in 2008. And after the conflict started, they decided to maintain their factory in Syria with the hopes that the conflict would be short and they would be able to benefit from the reconstruction following the conflict, being able to sell their cement. However, that's not what happened. What ended up happening was that to maintain and protect their factory and their workers, they had to pay bribes to ISIS and other armed groups. Sometimes these groups would kidnap their employees or vehicles off of their property, and they'd have to pay bribes to get that back. They eventually left Syria, I believe, in 2014, but they were recently found by a French court to have spent 13 million or billion, I have this written down, 13 million euros to armed groups, including ISIS, to protect their factories. There was also a case against them in France for endangering their employees because their employees were the ones who basically were kidnapped or targeted by these armed groups. Although I don't think that case was successful. And then the other thing I'll mention in terms of international and foreign companies is related to supply chains. Like I mentioned, there were a couple of cases against European companies for violating export control laws by selling pharmaceuticals and chemicals to Syria that were then including chemical weapons. And obviously those are related to sanctions and export control laws, not necessarily human rights abuses, but those are some of the ways that some of those companies were involved. I feel like I've talked a lot on that question, so I'll stop there, but just to say, I think because of the crony capitalist structure in Syria, the private sector is deeply embedded in the Assad regime, and I think that poses lots of risks for the future.
Thank you. That was a very helpful answer. I want to go back to something that Mariana mentioned about impact, right? We don't only want to kind of make intervention, but how can we make an impact and make a change? So Noor, can you just help us, based on your research and your expertise, what do you see as most concrete mechanism, right, for concrete and effective mechanisms for holding these perpetrators accountable for what's going on, right? What is a very important impact or policy do you see that this is something can happen?
Yeah, so I'll maybe break my answer into two parts. One is pre-December 8th,
Right.
And post-September 8th, December 8th, 2024. Pre-December 8th, when the Assad regime was still in power, there were very few options. And this was something when I headed the Human Rights and Business Unit at the Syrian Legal Development Program, we really struggled with. But I'll mention kind of a couple options that we had. One was economic sanctions. There were cases submitted against individual Syrian businessmen for, again, basically, as a way to hold them accountable and limit their ability to expand their businesses. Obviously, sanctions, I think, are a very controversial approach. There is a serious impact on civilians, and there is a question as to whether or not they're effective. But that was one way that was used to hold Syrian businesses accountable and limit their ability to kind of expand their businesses abroad beyond Syria. That said, there were also many strategies used to evade sanctions, and also I think with so many of Syria's allies also being sanctioned by the US and the EU, it sort of creates an alternative economy that they're still able to be a part of. And so I think that was something that happened. Many Syrian businessmen kind of tried to evade sanctions by putting all their money in Russia, for example, in Russian real estate, or in offshore accounts. I believe Rami Makhlouf was in the Panama Papers. So those are a couple of examples of how they were evading them. And then I mentioned this earlier, but the US in 2019 passed the Syria Civilian Protection Act, which was a really significant set of sanctions. And actually, I mentioned this earlier, but that was part of what kind of put a pause on the Marota City project, was that they really limited the funds that could go into that. The last thing I'll mention on sort of mechanisms that were useful pre-December 8th is asset freezes. Lots of Syrian businessmen had accounts and property throughout Europe. And so in the UK and I believe Switzerland, some of their accounts and their properties have been frozen or confiscated due to their listing on the sanctions list and things like that. And I believe there was also, I'm forgetting who it is now, but someone affiliated with the Assad regime's daughter was going to university in the UK, and she had a bank account that her parents would send her money, and I believe that account was also frozen. So those are a couple of examples of where that's happened, but I don't believe that there's been a significant amount of those. In terms of post December 8th, I think obviously a lot has changed. I think internally inside Syria, there's potentially lots of opportunity. But to be honest, I think there's not a lot of clarity on what next steps are. I know that after December 8th, many of Assad's cronies, economic elites fled to Lebanon, to Dubai, elsewhere. For a lot of them, we're not sure where they are right now, out of fear of retaliation. But also I know that the current government has kind of launched an investigation. Well, first of all, I think one step they took immediately was to freeze a lot of their accounts. But another step they took was to develop sort of a committee to investigate these businesses. And I think, and there have been reports that they have offered kind of settlements to some of them. Mohammed Hamsho, there's a report that he was offered $1 billion settlement where if he gives $1 billion to Syria, then basically he can be let back into the country and everything. And I think there's not a lot of clarity, and it seems like a lot of this is very ad hoc. And so to me, that's a little bit concerning. There are also reports that more recently, earlier this month, Syria signed a really significant energy deal worth, I believe, $7 billion. And there are reports that the owners of some of the companies involved are Mohammed Hamsho, the Syrian businessman.
He's the owner of the 3 companies.
The 3 companies.
Not one of them.
Yeah. So I mean, his nephews were the owners, but
the owner of the company in Qatar, and the owner of the version of the company in Syria, and the registration of the company in the US.
Yes.
So that's how the cryptocurrency system is starting now to take over. Yeah.
But also his name's not on it. His nephews' names are on it. And so what that tells me is this is more of what was happening under the Assad regime, where to avoid sanctions, they would create front companies where someone's wife is the owner or someone's nephew is the owner or cousin. And that was a way to avoid putting their name on there, a way to evade sanctions. And so to me, that's really concerning because it shows a continuation of previous trends of how business was conducted. And I think to a certain extent, there's a debate as to whether or not these companies should be held accountable because they do control the entire Syrian economy. And so for the Syrian economy to grow and develop, they have to be involved. But I do think that, I think my perspective is a couple of things. First of all, obviously, it's a very difficult needle to thread. The country's in a very dire situation, and people do want the country to develop. However, I think from my perspective, any deals made with some of these businesses right now should, first of all, include transparency. There needs to be transparency to the Syrian people about what's happening in order to develop trust, in order to develop some sense of understanding that accountability and justice is part of the equation, but also keeping a really close watch on these businesses, and any deals should be sort of at an interim level and not sort of erasing all crimes, but keeping it at an interim level. And then second of all, any sort of future steps with these companies needs to include a transitional justice process. They need to be part of some sort of truth-telling mechanism or accountability mechanism. And I think or even sort of an amnesty as part of a truth-telling mechanism, but there needs to be a process developed. And it seems like they're trying to rush to make some of these decisions just to get things moving forward. But I think that is really going to cause a lot of concern regarding, again, like I said, the trust of the Syrian people, and then also any feeling of reconciliation, of reparations is going to be kind of erased if the Syrian people don't have a role to play or don't get to actually benefit from these reparations. So I think that's where things are now. But yeah, to answer the question, it's very murky right now what next steps could exist. But like I said, I think the main things I'll say is transparency, reparations, including the Syrian people, and including the Syrian people, and then obviously these companies and these business people in a transitional justice process. And then, yeah, maybe I'll stop there for that question.
I think your last part of the answer about the mechanisms for how corporations should be involved in transitional justice mechanism is very helpful, because you actually answered my second questions about how really corporations should be involved, right, in those conversations for past harms and for participation in future reconstructions. I don't know if you want to add anything to that question.
Yeah, I will say a little bit more. A couple things I'll say is also now that sort of sanctions have been removed from Syria and they're moving towards reconstructing the country, there's going to be a lot of interest from foreign companies to get involved. And I think this highlights a really key opportunity for completely redeveloping and re-understanding what the Syrian economy looks like. Like I said, it was very much a crony capitalist economic system, but there really needs to be an intentional effort to make sure that that's not the case moving forward, that corruption is completely rooted out, and that the economy creates room for small and medium-sized businesses and folks who are not part of the small circle to benefit and to grow as well. And so I think that's one thing that's really important at this point. The other thing that's really important is maybe this is turning more to like foreign and international companies. One thing I would be very concerned about is companies coming in and taking advantage of poor economic systems that don't protect workers, that don't protect small businesses, and exploiting that for their own benefit. And so I think one thing that will also be really important is to ensure that human rights are protected in companies' operations, and really making sure that foreign companies coming in are conducting human rights assessments before they're operating with any companies, before they take on any new projects. Kind of, again, like the Marota City project, for example, on the outside can just look like a construction development, but when you look in detail, what they're doing is really entrenching previous crimes, building over destroyed homes so that people can't come back to their previous homes, so that they're re-engineering the demographics of those neighborhoods. So really making sure that companies coming into Syria in the future are making sure that they're not contributing to that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Noor. I would like to switch to Mohammed, conversations on transitional justice, particularly in Syria. So Mohammed is the director of Syria Justice and Accountability Center. He's also a former prisoner and a human rights and democracy researcher and activist. Thank you for being with us, Mohammed. Mohammed brings both lived experience as a torture survivor and prisoner and professional experts. And as executive director of the Syria Justice Accountability Center, under his leadership, the center has created Syria's most comprehensive database on human rights violations currently. I checked your website yesterday, and it's very intensive data on human rights violations, really intensive. Contributing evidence to international prosecutions and UN investigations. His intervention today will examine how systematic documentation and technology can support transitional justice efforts and what Syria experience reveals about pursuing accountability while conflict dynamics continue to evolve. I would like to start the conversation today first as a survivor of this regime, drawing from your experience and your expertise in research. How was your personal journey really, and how was shaped by all these experiences and now documenting all these violations really?
Yeah.
Can you talk to us more about it?
Sure. Thank you very much for having us here today. I wouldn't go to too much details there, but I would say a few things is growing up in Syria, part of the day-to-day exchange with the government, with the authorities, is that actually you're kind of hitting a wall every time you're touching any of these sensitive topics. Noor did an amazing job outlining all the system, include the economic corruption, the kleptocracy, I call it, more than crony business, crony capitals, where you're in trouble if you write an article, if you basically criticize corruption, if you demand more transparency about certain businesses, if you speak about how the cell phone companies made it to Syria and who owned them and how the wealth was distributed. 2 members of the parliament in Syria ended up in prison for actually touching on that subject in the parliament in Syria because when they demanded investigation. And then you land in prison. While I was in law school at the time, I was like, okay, everything you study there is like, we don't do it here. Like, you don't have a lawyer. We don't have a lawyer in prison. You're not represented by anybody. I appeared before 3 courts who were exchanging jurisdiction over the case. The State Security Court, which was later abolished. And then say, I want a lawyer. It's like, yeah, we don't do this here. We have summary procedures here. And then, okay, let's go to the military court, the criminal court. And then there's no crime. They dismiss the case. And then went to the military court, and I was civilian. I never served in the military. I was like, okay, why you have the jurisdiction here? He's like, because we had the referral from the intelligence. So this is how the system operated. So looking at all this and trying to make sense of the data coming from Syria, you develop higher sensitivity when you see misbehavior from authorities. That's why I'm really anxious about what's happening in Damascus, because I see the authorities messing up the transitional justice process. Today they had a press conference, and it was a disaster about the transitional justice. So one of the members of the peace building committee spoke about why former militia leaders were granted hidden amnesty, more or less. That's not even public. And of course, sweeping everything under the rug, like the victims, their rights, their families, the demand, the truth, the reparation, restitution, like, is for our national benefit and the necessity for the transition. This guy was granted immunity by the president. That's Fadi Sakr. Fadi Sakr is the former leader and the founder of the National Defense Forces. One of the most notorious militias were founded around Damascus southern suburb. Fadi Sakr led the work there. If you follow the Tadamun massacre story, that's his militia who committed that violation. So that's developed so high level sensitivity for me when I see all these misbehaviors around accountability, around justice, and also I developed more a sense of like the problem is not actually with individuals. It's not Ali Mamlouk and Jamil al-Hassan, the former leaders of the intelligence agencies. The problem is with the system. When the opposition started forming fighters and armed groups in 2012, they start disappearing people, they start torturing people, they did summary executions. They repeated the same crimes they actually started the protest against in 2011. And there's a system where the violations in Syria are deeply rooted in the culture in the country. It's part of the day-to-day businesses. The violence is normalized in the country, and everybody come to peace with this reality. You know, I'm governing this area. I'm going to torture everybody. I'm going to execute people who disagree with me. I'm going to detain people who oppose my ruling, etc. And this, you can generalize this without any basically concern that SDF did this, the Syrian National Army backed by Turkey did that, the Free Syrian Army did it to a certain scale. Of course, ISIS, HTS, where Ahmed al-Shara comes from, they still have detainees in their prisons in Idlib. So he freed all the detainees in Assad prison, but he kept the ones he kept in Idlib because those are other story. So that's why my personal story, I met my father in Sadnaya prison. He was there. And then we learned my brother was in Sadnaya prison later, but we couldn't meet with him. And then we were toured between Sadnaya prison and Adra prison, different courts. And all this spoke to one thing, is this lack of due process in the country. There's lack of establishing rule of law in the country. And that's exactly what's happening today in Syria. Judiciary is on hold because somebody decided to postpone the judiciary for the past 7 months. And of course, you cannot create an environment for businesses to show up in the country if you don't have court system. If I have a civil dispute with your company and I want to go to court, there's no court system. And backing the court system with former HTS leadership, whether religious or non-religious leadership, just putting them in positions very sensitive, actually, to run the country. I was sharing with one friend here in the audience that I met with the prosecutor general when I was in Damascus, who was right-wing religious person from HTS, but we had a middle ground that Syria needs a civil law. And that's how Syria should work, except he was fired and he was replaced by somebody who was not accepting the civil law as a matter of governance in Syria. So my personal story made me very anxious and very sensitive to all these things and very critical of what's happening in the system today. And especially when you see it took 6 months for Ahmed al-Shara to land on creating 2 commissions, one Transitional Justice Commission and one Missing Persons Commission. Well, of course, there's an overlap between them, but the Transitional Justice Commission, the Missing Persons Commission was given a good general wide kind of mandate, find the missing persons. The Transitional Justice Commission to investigate the crimes committed by al-Assad regime. Like, how about the others? ISIS committed a lot, HTS committed a lot, the Syrian government, Russia, Hezbollah, Iran, Shia militias from Iraq. And you have a long list of people, like, why you're excluding those by default? Just putting it this way. And also, transitional justice is not mere criminal accountability, right? It's not putting people on trial. I understand nobody will put themselves on trial and their peers and friends and network, but it's about truth telling, about reparation process, about restitution for those victims, about basically trying to provide closure and memorialization and ensure non-reoccurrence. All this is packed in the mandate of the Transitional Justice Commission, except basically it's limited to one side justice, which is again repeating the same story of the victors' justice version, where they want to put the losers on trial and end of it. And that is not going to help the country move forward or pass the legacy. And one of the things Bashar al-Assad did in 2000 when he showed up, when he inherited the presidency from his dad, was he released all the prisoners, except he failed to do any truth-telling processes about those who disappeared under his father's prison years. Doing that would have been an amazing step that would have basically established a little bit rule of law. But since we're flipping the page on anybody who disappears, and eventually that creates and establishes a system of lack of due process and rule of law. And yesterday, a Sharia, I'm not sure if it's an amnesty or not, non-amnesty, secret amnesty or presidential pardon, he released those who were detained from certain military units who were detained around December. They were fighting against the government. And in the news, and the Ministry of Interior, they had no blood in their hands. As a legal practitioner, that decision comes from a judge, not from somebody in the palace saying you have no blood in your hand. That's where the investigations. Did you publish their names? Did you allow the public to go and file a complaint against them? Because I don't know who is in your custody, and I might have personal grievances against them who basically violated my rights, etc. So that's why I look at the situation today in Syria with a little bit cautious. And I think one of the reasons why this is happening is that the authority is not willing to rely on experts in this field. They just want to rely on their own inner circle of people who clearly has no idea on what was transitional justice. And they had a couple of amazing Syrian experts, and some of them are our colleagues, Brahim Alabi and Qutayb Edelbi, but those are to the foreign ministry because we want to put a good face to the internationals. But for the domestic people, we're not going to work with those people. So part of my concern now on the post-Assad Syria, we're going to repeat the same things. Not necessarily in the same scale, not necessarily sweeping disappearance of people and execution of in custody like the Caesar photos showed us, but without a rule of law, without due processes, without enforcing the Syrian laws, it's going to be problematic. It's much easier to have tendency to violate people's rights when you don't uphold the law. And because of the polarization in the country today, and it's at unprecedented level, people are accepting violations when it's against others. And that's a trend we've seen in the country in the last 12 years. And you've seen bad justification for it. It's even when people who love Saddam Hussein try to defend him, it's he killed the Shia and the Kurds. Those are Iraqi citizens, they should not be killed. And now we get the same defense. Well, the Alawis, they killed a lot of the people, so the attacks on the Alawis on the coast is being justified a little bit. And unfortunately, this narrative is not from average people. You get some activists, civil society leadership, and the Apologia gang now try to defend the authorities, saying, well, they committed things before, and now is the time that people turned against them. And that's all keeps me up at night, to be honest. I'm not pleased how things are going. And I think we can do much better. And that's my problem. We can do better. That if Syria doesn't have the resources, the technical people to do it or anything, okay, fine, it's a bad country. We don't know. But we do have those people, but they're blocked from actually contributing to the process.
This is a very good conversation. I want to go back to the conversations on how we have expertise really being pushed on the foreign ministry, but really we're not working on domestic politics. I want to go back to this conversation if we have time, because this is very important, because it goes back to the conversation on forecasting, right? What's next in Syria? What are we going to look like in the next few years? Are we going to have the same conversation? So thank you so much for this. I want to highlight some of the work that you have done with your team and the Syrian institution, the civil society organization, Syria Justice and Accountability Center. So you have a very comprehensive database right now on human rights violations from all sides of the Syrian conflict. It's available online, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Not quite online, no, it's not available to the public.
To the public, okay. So can you talk to us about this technology? How did you get this data? How did you coded that data? And how is really like why comprehensive database is really important right now, part of your work
Sure.
on transitional justice?
Sure. So basically, in order to do something meaningful and in the right way, it needs to be substantiated by evidence, by information. So we cannot just say ex-militia committed these crimes because such allegation will not stand in a court floor. You need to defend that and you need to supply the data that supports the claims. So that's we engaged in certain efforts. We downloaded around 2 million videos from YouTube. This is before YouTube started deleting videos from the violations, and we kept those. And we questions like the hosting cost, like do we have a value of them, they are public, etc. But then when prosecutors in Europe start pinging us and saying, we want this video was showing X and Z, but the video is deleted. But we have the ID of the videos, like we have the video. And we have the process of downloading the video with a timestamp, with a chain of custody showing exactly who downloaded the video and who edited the video and who touched the video, and all preserved. And it's admissible in a court flow. And that's why providing those materials to prosecutors was a validation that what we did was correct. The second major effort was extracting intelligence documents from government buildings. And this is when the government collapsed in certain area. Between 2013 and 2016, we extracted around 500,000 pages of documents from Tabqa, Raqqa, and Idlib. And those are intelligence records. Classified documents, some of them are highly classified. We did one big study on 5,000 document sample in 2019. We called it Walls Have Ears, because that's exactly what the documents do. The intelligence are spying on everybody, on everyone, spying on each other, reporting everything. But a couple of the themes we've seen in the documents as well were showing that detainees are documented, including children and women. And there's admission to commission crimes. Basically, there's orders was given, and there's a theme word, do the necessary. So under every document, oh, we know the opposition gang is preparing for a protest, please do the necessary. And do the necessary turned out to be used lethal force against those people, because the videos showing that. And what we did was matching the documents with the videos. And that was a good analysis exercise. When one document, it shows that Arastan Hospital and Homs are treating, in quote, the terrorist. Terrorist, anybody against the government, not necessarily a fighter, could be a civilian. So we launched artillery and helicopter attacks on the hospital. And General Fuad Al-Tawil says one word, agreed, without any due process, protecting civilians and differentiation between civilians, the duty of distinction between civilians and legitimate targets. But then we found the videos of attacking that hospital, uploaded on YouTube by somebody, third party, happened to be inside the hospital, and he was filming all injured civilians inside the hospital. This is a clear war crime. Just you got the order, you got the actions, and you get the result of it. Yeah? So we did that. Post December 8, we engaged in a couple of efforts, including taking more documents, because the intelligence building were open to the public. Unfortunately, people were looting documents, taking it outside, of course, stealing chairs and computers and screens. We ended up extracting 1.3 million documents. So we had 700,000 documents from Damascus, 340,000 documents from Raqqa and Hasaka, because SDF left the buildings open. And we had around 50,000 documents from the National Defense Forces in Hamas. And we brought everything. We had 2 big offices in Damascus as of December 12 or 13, with generators, with big scanners, auto feeders, and we scanned everything. When the Ministry of Justice said, we want the documents back, everybody, we handed the originals and we have the scans. And now we're working, we have a 1.5-year project to analyze everything and tag everything. So now, going through the documents, although the documents we had in 2013 to 2016 were from different areas in Syria, but everything in Syria was extremely centralized to a sick level. Like Damascus knew everything. Everything. I'll give you an example. The political security branch of Idlib saying to the political security directorate general of Damascus, we send you back the list of women and children detained in our branch per the template you supplied. Damascus supplied the template to be filled, not only knew about it. So anybody want to deny, Bashar al-Assad didn't know about this, or he did not order, or security agents, we have the documents, we have the information, we have everything. Now, of course, we interviewed thousands of survivors of torture, bombardment, sexual violence, a mixed number of people. And we have a big forensic program in Northeast Syria focused on the graves ISIS left, unfortunately, with the missing people there. Now, putting all this together, a couple of things here is, we have evidence on everyone. And I know that's not pleasing for today's authority, but that's part of the reality. And also, that could support any elements of transitional justice. You want to do criminal accountability? We have the evidence. You want to do truth-telling process? We have the documents, the orders, and we have the videos. I can show this. You want to do institutional reform, which is very important in a context of 54 years of bad bad government. Basically, you do vetting and restoration. You make sure who the people who committed the crime and you get them out of the system. The people you cannot prosecute, you just block them from running to public offices. You need the documents, you need the evidence for them, and the names are there, and that's what we do. We designed a database, relational database. The commercial database in the market were expensive, and of course you get a free first year, but then you have to pay whatever, tens of thousands every year. So we ended up designing our own system in-house, some coders and IT folks, Syrians, all Syrians. We had some international help. And now the database in 9 languages is being used from Ukraine to Tigray, to Iraq, to several other countries. I don't want to name everything, but we have it in several languages. And now this is one of the things we could offer the state in Syria. And this is what I offered to the prosecutor general when I met with him. It's like, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We'll give you the database, we'll give you the methodology, we'll give you the documents, we'll show you how to scan the documents and how to tag them. And the discussion, although the former prosecutor general was so positive and he really wanted to engage in this, and we agreed to train some judges and build some capacity in the country. The problem was like, we don't trust anyone. And eventually I got so frustrated after 2 years 2 hours of back and forth. We cannot trust 50 students from the law school in Damascus. Just pick 50 students, vet them, and we'll donate the laptops and the server, put it in an office, and they could do all the documents like in 6 months work. The one thing I'm hoping to do also in Syria is capacity building, because we don't study international law in Syria. So unless you get your legal training outside or you catch up with the courses you missed. So we don't have prosecutors, judges, or lawyers who could prosecute, litigate, or adjudicate cases of core international crimes. And leave it under the Syrian penal code is possible, but then a lot of these crimes are not coded in the Syrian penal code, and you cannot prosecute somebody based on them. Let's say you captured somebody, you have to prove they killed somebody. But if they were ordering the killing, but they didn't commit, that's where you need international criminal law jurisprudence to say, okay, you're responsible for your subordinates' behavior because you ordered or at least had the knowledge and you should have known what they were doing. And that's why the Koblenz court in Germany, when the former intelligence colonel from Syria faced charges there, like you didn't have to prove he killed people by his hand, but you were leading an intelligence branch, and dead bodies were coming from that branch under torture, and as the Caesar photos were showing. So it was easy case to indict the person and to, yeah.
You mentioned something, I have a question. It could be for either Mariana or Muhammad, because I think it applies to both of your work. You mentioned institutional reform, and I think this is very important. And I have a question, because we know there is transformative justice and there is a transitional justice, right? And those are 2 different concepts, but they're related. Transformative justice focus more on a systematic change, right? More institutional level, change distributions of power within the institutions. But the transitional justice works more on like documenting those crimes. So I don't know who is much more interested in like talking to us more about the relationships and what is currently going on in Syria when it comes to those 2 processes, the transformative and the transitional justice.
I can take a quick step, and then Mariana, if you want.
Yes.
Quickly, what we've seen of dismissing thousands, around 400,000 of civil servants, they were sent home. And that's kind of, in my opinion, this is de-Baathification 2.0. Like, we're not sending everybody home who was in the Al-Ba'ath party, but we'll do it a little bit in a smart way so we don't get called out by international experts and by international powers. So under the pretext of overemployment, which is the state did overemploy people, it's okay, we're going to dismiss people, but you go through the sheets of, we get leaked documents as well from those ministries. And the people, for example, in the Ministry of Health, you see by province where the majority of the people were dismissed, and then you see them belong to certain sectarian group, Alawis, and those were targeted to be kicked out of the civil servant. And now, at the same time, you see elitish businessmen who were corrupt, funded crimes, as Noor eloquently put it together, and also they were basically helping the regime evading sanctions. They're being rehabilitated and they're brought back to the system. And they are leading things now, and you cannot criticize Mohammed Hamsho actually in Syria. There's a Syrian lawyer volunteered to file a case against him in Syria. And then the authorities called the Syrian lawyer, threatened him, and forced him to sign a document saying he's not going to bring this case up again. So like not only coming back with reconciliation where he has to pay some money, but also giving them protection and threatening the people who are seeking legal remedies for their behaviors. So I think what's happening in Syria is neither that nor this. Like it's not transitional justice, it's not transformative justice, it's just day-to-day, kick the can down the road. We'll worry about this later. When people get upset about it, we'll try to react. And today's press conference was supposed to explain to the people why the amnesty or the pardon happened and why those people were released and why certain leaders of the militias are actually still in leading positions in today's state, Syria state. And the press conference kind of exploded with angry journalists and victims basically screaming at the speaker saying, like, this is bad, and you don't actually have the right to forgive those people. The rights is with us. We are the victims. And that shows you exactly the lack of victim-centered approach with the state. They don't understand victim-centered. They don't care about it. And if they're trying to enforce it, they're doing it in a bad way. Mariana, if you want to.
Thank you.
Just shortly to elaborate, I agree with everything Muhammad has mentioned, and I think that it was also a longer conversation that we were having even before that's not usually. The question was, are we building cases in relation to universal jurisdiction in a transformative way? Are we highlighting certain incidents that go back to what laws are applied on certain individuals and how these crimes were committed? And then the question after the fall of the Assad regime was, there was a transition of power. I mean, there was the toppling of the regime, but by the end of the day, this group became responsible to or took power to be governing the whole country. And I think this is where a transformative approach misses its point. A transformative approach needs a checks and balances, needs civil society, needs survivors and victims to come and say, this is how we perceive the work that should be done in Syria. Institutions that were mentioned by you and Muhammad at the moment should not only be developed by the government. The government should not say, this is the institution of transitional justice, and this is the person who will be appointed to lead the transitional justice institution and the institution for disappeared people, because we have other institutions as well, like the IMP, that was actually, with all the different critiques from different people on it, by the end of the day, survivors of certain crimes had a role to play in initiating such an institution. Now, ignoring the whole presence of this institution and starting an institution from scratch, and I think Anna can speak more about the experience from Colombia on how these institutions started, cannot ensure any transformation. I think when we think about institutional transformation, it's about laws that are governing due processes that have been mentioned, but also behavior. We've heard reportedly also from Syrians in Syria, for example, in certain institutions saying, now we don't pay bribes anymore. Before we were paying bribes. Not paying bribes is good. But then we had apologists from the Syrian institutions as well saying, but also with good grounds, right? Saying that bribes were taken because people working within these institutions did not have salaries that can actually make ends meet. And this creates this whole cycle. So if we want to ensure that people are not being bribed or not taking bribes, we need to ensure fair payment to those individuals who are working in these institutions, so on and so forth. I think where practices you see have changed to some extent in certain areas, they did not really transform. And for them to transform, you need the civil society to have a role. You need critiques from people like Muhammad, for example, coming and saying, those are not right, and we need the expertise. And that's very important coming from diaspora, because it can contribute to a certain extent without necessarily having to copy, paste any model that we see from outside.
I think this is a very important point, that civil society have to play an essential point in any political transitional system. One reason I can add to that is the civil society have access to the people. Those are people in their communities, right? They know the people, they know the system, they know what is needed. They have access to the resources. They're not sitting in their high-powered offices. And so this kind of conversation with the people is very important. So thank you for that answer. Hamad, you mentioned in your answer that you've worked with a lot of international organizations on the war crimes and what's going on in Syria and accountability. Can you talk to us more about your experience with them, where the international community really stands when it comes to accountability, and how is really the involvement is going on when it comes to accountability and human rights violations that happened in Syria?
Yeah, sure. So in short, international, like basically European states mainly, because a lot of Syrians in Europe versus other countries, but also the US had a couple of cases. Under universal jurisdiction principle, it allows the state to prosecute a foreigner for a crime committed in a different country against different nationals. So you don't have to be German or commit a crime in Germany or against a German national to be prosecuted. The German authorities have the jurisdiction to prosecute such person under international law. As simple as that. And that's where the Europeans start reactivating. So the universal jurisdiction was kind of starting to touch the legal systems in Europe around 2000, 2002. But then you get Iraq war and Afghanistan war. So the US pressured the Europeans a lot to trim their jurisdiction. So Donald Rumsfeld is not being prosecuted in Brussels, and also there are a couple of Palestinian cases against Ariel Sharon and Stevie Livni in London. But then these European states came back and after 2012 and said, well, a lot of changes in the Arab countries and a lot of refugees landing in our country and a lot of war crimes committed. We don't want to repeat previous behavior. So they start reactivating this legal norm, universal jurisdiction. So in every country, there's a war crime unit where they are in charge of basically investigating and prosecuting international crimes. And those war crime units reach to us simply and just basically saying, we're tracking this individual, he's in our soil, what do you know about them? And what do you have in your database on them? Or we know this case or this situation, what do you know about this situation in general? And sometimes it's just an attack in certain village or town that involved several actors. So we download the videos, we get the documents, and we send them. And in some certain cases, we testified as experts or provided certain written statements. And there's a case here in the US, by miracle, a former prison director of Adra prison showed up to retire in the US after he was a prison director and a governor in Syria. And when I was approached by the FBI about this case, this is still under litigation, so I'm not going to speak much. Like, hey, do you know this guy? I was in his prison. He was the prison director when I was in my prison. So yeah, I know him. And one of the question was, did he have active control of the prison? Like, yeah, he signed my library card by his hand, and I still kept it after 19 years. I was going to go to the court now in LA. So no matter how smart those criminals, they end up going to certain countries to retire. And unfortunately, sometimes with fake names and fake passports. And this is part of the concern now in Europe, that the former elite or the former officials in the Syrian regime made it to Europe with different identity cards. Basically, if their faces are not known, and not all of them are known by face. So it's easy to get an actual, not forged, an actual Syrian state issued documentations like ID and passports and make it to Europe with the wealth of money they have. So part of the work of the international war crimes units now in these European countries is to enforce the no safe haven, basically. Nobody is coming to live and retire in our country after committing crimes in different countries. And there's unfortunately scandals in prior conflicts. A lot of perpetrators of international crimes from Rwanda ended up in Netherlands. And some of them were naturalized, became Dutch citizens. And then the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda, ICTR, subpoenaed the Dutch citizens to go face charges in the case. So that created some political pressures in certain states, and they don't want to see this again. Let alone, of course, you're admitting criminals who committed heinous crimes against civilians, and they become part of your society and country. That's why refugee cases are being looked so thoroughly. A lot of documentation is being required, a lot of review of certain cases, and the videos and the images and the materials on social media, it helps a lot. And unfortunately, sometimes there's a bad practice of a journalist is tracking a former official. They'll go, oh yeah, this official made it to Germany and he put in his picture, he's in Hamburg. And I was like, in no time, that person will be deleting their Facebook account and removing the pictures. I was like, hey, let us download those first and let us preserve the materials. So part of the work with also the UN IIIM, the International Independent Impartial Mechanism for Syria, is we provide them live access to our server. They look in our materials, they see what we tagged, what we downloaded, what documents we analyze, and they use it in their investigations they're building. So there's that type of collaboration. But again, it takes everybody. And that's a question we get like, hey, should justice in Syria be domestic or should be international or should be hybrid? It should be all the above. We need courts in Syria to take up cases. We need courts in Europe to continue to take up cases. And we need any kind of hybrid mechanism. If any country, and I know France is trying to do so, will try to build the capacity of the judiciary in Syria and build kind of training models, etc. A lot of the Syrian laws are interpreted actually from the French because France occupied Syria before. And that will be very much appreciated effort by those member states to support accountability and justice, but also not to limit it to criminal accountability or criminal prosecution, because again, everything was discussed so far about truth-telling, about reparation, restitution, institutional reform. All these mechanisms are helpful to ensure non-reoccurrence. And unfortunately, there's a lot of what's being discussed today is just rhetoric in Syria. We don't see much actions. We get a lot of discussions and a lot of talk about a lot of things, but like we look at the actions for 7 months now, quite modest, I would say, yeah.
Thank you. That's a very helpful answer. I want to switch here to turn to Anna.
Very sorry, Anna, that's a long Syria.
That was a very helpful and comprehensive answer, so I really appreciate it. I do want to go back to some of the questions later if we have time on the international community involvement when it comes. To switch here to Anna, with Anna Interventions, we're doing comparative analysis with transitional justice in Colombia and what can we learn from this experience when it comes to Syria. Anna is a master's student at Georgetown University, and will contribute in a comparative lens drawing from lessons from Colombia transitional justice. She's done a lot of work on the transitional justice process in Colombia, and she will reflect on what Syria might learn from the Colombian experience of negotiating peace, designing victim-centered legal framework, and managing the integration, truth commissions, and institutional reform. Her analysis will also consider what not to replicate from the Colombian experience, examining some pitfalls and ideas for the futures. So I want to start with Anna on the questions of what key lessons from the Syria can draw from the Colombian experience when it comes to transitional justice, particularly in terms of peace negotiation, victim-centered framework, and institutional reform. So what can we learn from what happened in Colombia as Syrians today, looking in the future for this country?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm very happy to be here and to share Colombia's experience in victim-centered transitional justice as an opportunity for Syria to replicate and to avoid some of the lessons that we have learned. I know that every situation and every context is different, so there is no perfect model. And what we can have here is what I see as a chance of global South solidarity and how we sometimes export models from the West that not necessarily fit our specific context in the global South. So just to have a brief overview, in 2016, the state of Colombia signed a peace agreement with the Armed Revolutionary Forces of Colombia, who was a guerrilla who was active starting in the 1960s. And it was a historic moment, not only for Colombia, but in the field of peace building because of the voices that were included since the beginning of the negotiations. So we would see how women, victims of the conflict from diverse backgrounds and the private sector were included since the beginning of the process and were allowed to mainstream into the implementation of the peace agreement. So the agreement included 6 chapters. One of them was specific to the victims. And this is where the integral system for truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition was instituted. There were 3 main institutions. So we have the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, that is the one specific for transitional justice. We have the Truth Commission, and then we have the Unit for Missing Persons, the Unit for the Search of Missing Persons. So we can now see 2 comparisons to what the already Syria has, the Truth Commission and the Transitional Justice. The thing is that here I see a difference to Syria is that our transitional justice, the 3 institutions I just named, apply to all citizens and all actors involved in the conflict. So in the transitional justice, we have people from the private sector, we have state actors, including military and local authorities, and the guerrillas involved, as well as other actors that may have been identified in the process. In the case of the missing persons, we also look from victims, forced disappearances, but we have also looked for disappearances members of the guerrillas. So it does not discriminate against which actor of the conflict was disappeared. It includes all citizens of the country. So here I see a main difference with Syria, which only applies for the crimes committed by the Assad regime. So three key lessons that I want to mention. First of all, as I said before, it's the voices that were included since the beginning of the process. So the voices of women, the voices of victims from diverse backgrounds, Afro-Colombians, indigenous communities, and the private sector. And this inclusivity has allowed for further sustainability of this process. The second is that this works as a system. So the Truth Commission, the report, even if it is already finished, the report was published. The Unit for Missing Persons uses this report and uses this information to continue its search for the missing people. And it works to complement each other between the transitional justice, the missing persons, and the Truth Commission. And third is it is a real victim-centered narrative that we have had, and how before, and maybe on ordinary justice we see this, is that the focus is on the perpetrator. So if we think of a specific crime, we think of the name of the perpetrator, of the abuser, and we do not see the victims as the center of the process. In the transitional justice mechanism that we have in the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the victims are the ones, for example, that choose which reparation they want the perpetrator to give to them. So they choose the type of restorative justice, and this is putting the victims in the center. When we go to a hearing in the transitional justice, we see how the victims bring sometimes things from their specific communities or their cultural demonstrations that we would not see in ordinary justice. And this is, for me, three key lessons that I would like to see replicated or maybe taken into account by the Syrians in their process towards democracy and justice.
That's helpful. Thank you. To build on this question, I want to go back to the Colombian experience. I know you've done a lot of work on the Colombian experience. Can you speak to us more about the pitfalls or the challenges that happened in Colombia during the transitional justice process? Just to learn more as we do a cross-competitive case study here between Syria and Colombia.
Okay, first, to answer which pitfalls, I would start by, I want you to all imagine what would justice look like for you if prisons didn't exist. Take a moment to think on that and try to answer that, and how for some of us it's difficult, because at least in the experience of Colombia, that is what I can talk to, we have, from a Christian point of view, as justice as being punitive. And like, we want justice, we want punishment. And this is both the transitional justice process and the restorative justice processes are both new concepts and new ways of thinking that are difficult for people in the country and even for some lawmakers to implement because of this view of justice as punishment. So I would say that this is one of the obstacles or the challenges, is to understand this new view of transitional justice and restorative justice. Second, I would say that a challenge that one should avoid in Syria, in my humble opinion, is this maximalism, and how we have to avoid having expectations too high and be aware of the limitations that we have. And today, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace has 11 cases that include geographical areas or macro cases of a specific violation. So for example, there is a macro case on sexual violence. There is a macro case on kidnappings. There is a macro case on forced recruitment of minors. And it includes personal cases. So the jurisdiction checks and reviews case by case. And this is an infinite and an eternal process that won't be able to succeed in giving the expectations that one has. So first, this view of punishment, justice as punishment, and understanding the new transitional justice and restorative justice approach. Second, being aware of our limitations. And third, I would also say the part of storytelling. And because in Colombia, unfortunately, this peace agreement brought a lot of polarization, and society and the nation was divided in people who did support the peace process, people who were against it. And the transitional justice was actually one of the main points of disagreement, and how I think that the government and the state of Colombia failed in the way to properly explain what the objective of transitional justice is and how we can sometimes, as my panelists have said, we cannot sometimes have the punishment of all the ones who committed war crimes or were involved in the conflict, but we can get the victims to get closure, to get restoration, and to guarantee non-repetition. So at the same time, not only the government failed to properly explain to the nation, but also how civil society in a democracy also has the responsibility to be involved in these processes. And it's not, we cannot leave everything to the responsibility of the government, but we as citizens of our nation that want to build and want to promote justice or reconciliation, we have to also own the process and maybe work in our communities, in our spaces of influence to support this process. So I would say that understanding transitional justice and restorative justice is a challenge and will be a challenge for Syria. Having the limitations clear and not seeking maximalism. And third, properly explaining this narrative and the story and the aims that it looks for.
You mentioned something very interesting in your answer. You talked about how there was a division in Colombia, between those who supported certain elements and those who did not support it, the peace process. So I guess my questions goes to something that also Muhammad talked about it, about the importance of trust, right? They don't trust these new expert-minded. So my question is, in a context like Colombia, but also Syria, when you have a diverse group of people who have different opinions and different positions across those issues, and there is a question of trust here, how do you really, like, what's your recommendation and suggestions here in a post-conflict situations to overcome this trust issue among diverse group of people who have different opinions and positions across those issues? What can you learn? What can you talk to us about from the Colombian experience? And it's open also to all our panelists on the Syrian experience as well.
In my experience and my personal experience doing field work in Colombia, Colombia is a 50 million, we have a population of 50 million. We have a very big and diverse country. We have indigenous groups, we have Afro population, and we have a very big gap between the urban and the rural areas. But I think that to build trust, because there are some areas where because of conflict and because of violence, people don't even trust their neighbor, or social leaders don't trust the mayor of their city, of their municipality. And in my experience, the first thing that we can do is dialogue, and to have spaces where people engage with the perpetrator, maybe with people, other people in the community who weren't exposed to each other, people talking to the local authorities, and these spaces of transitional justice, the Truth Commission, when you would see the hearings of the Truth Commission or the public hearings for the transitional justice, you see how you put in the same space the perpetrator, the military who was part of state abuses, abuse of force abuses, sitting down with the mother of the young man who was disappeared and saying, I am sorry, I am taking accountability, I want to heal, and I can't take back what I did, but I want to heal your family and I want to be part of the healing of the nation. So trust is built when you have a dialogue between people in your community, but also between the people who were once involved in the conflict and want to build trust, because that's also part of the issue. If you are not able to talk to the one who wronged you or the one who committed these atrocities, because that's also valid when you don't want to hug the person who recruited your son or daughter. So trust is built with dialogue and in wanting to build this reconciliation process in Colombia or in Syria.
Thank you. And yeah, if any of the speakers would like to add anything from the Syrian experience when it comes to trust, because I really believe trust is an important component when we talk about any transitional justice and state building capacity in a fragile political environment like Syria.
I can take a stab at this. I'm not the most optimistic person in life in general. I'm quite skeptic and how things are going in the region altogether, not only in Syria, to be honest. If you look at the right, you see Iraq, and you look at the left, you see Lebanon. Both countries have their basically conflicts, civil wars, change of regime, whatever you want to call it, but then both they failed in their transitions. And that's why we still see militias governing Iraq in a bad way, and we see the same level of violations, not in the same, exactly same way, but you see kidnapping, torture, execution of activists, etc., corruption. And same with Lebanon. Yeah, there's 16,000 Lebanese missing still from the civil war. Basically because the warlords came to the parliament and became part of the authority, they of course had zero incentive to open that file about themselves. So they passed an amnesty to everybody, and they ignored the victims. And being in that context doesn't help much, because unfortunately there's a lot of bad experience we could draw from. And the joke I usually have is like, let's do new mistakes. Like that has been done in Syria, in Iraq, or in Lebanon, didn't work and things. But I have concerns on the whole path from December 8th. Like the national dialogue was created by the authorities, which supposedly could have been an amazing place to discuss this very topic. Like, what does justice mean to us? How are we going to look at other victims? Okay, somebody's son was a soldier in the military and he killed a member of my family. But then killing that person, and he's a breadwinner of a family, but the family could be punished indirectly. All this needs to be debated. And in a very polarized community where, unfortunately, it's rooted in the community and the area that the winner is taking all. That's how it is in the region. And the national dialogue ended up being a disaster, being really, really bad show, like not even, like it was miserable. And then the constitution came up, which also a constitutional declaration centralized the power even worse in the hands of Sharia only for the next 5 years, where for the first time in Syria, or maybe in the world, the president will appoint parliament for the next two rounds. Like, and that keeping me skeptic about like how we're going to get a dialogue if the national dialogue is not a platform for it. How we're going to get this conversation. Today in the press conference, the exchange between the National Peace Committee and the angry people who are demanding answers to how you're releasing those people in the street and how you're not doing trials. It's also showing that the dialogue is not happening. Like, we're going to scream at you, we're going to accuse you, and we're going to threat us, and then we're going to go back to our constituents and say, well, the authority is lying to everybody, let's mobilize against them, which is unfortunately, it's in nobody's interest to have that tense relation anyway between both sides. I think Sharia had an interview with a Jordanian YouTuber. His name is Joe Hattab. This is like December 15, December 14. It got published like a couple of weeks later till Joe edited his thing. Sharia said explicitly, well, we give our words to a lot of people who laid down their weapons or who can facilitated our access to Damascus without a bloodbath. And we cannot take those words back. We have to honor our promises. But if you're a bad perpetrator who killed people on Sednaya or executed people on a checkpoint and things, you will be held accountable for that. So more or less, if you're known and famous in the crime, and the crime you committed was well documented to the public, we're going to capture you on this symbolic justice. But we're going to let the others. This is exactly what's happening. What he spoke about in December 14th is happening. It's his vision, personal vision of how this needs to happen. It's not the experts. It's not the civil society. It's not. And I worry about using the international community pressure because I don't want to equate accountability and transitional justice to international intervention. We don't want to go to the French and to the Germans and to the EU and to the US, say, listen, pressure them on this, because this should be organic from the country, from the people. And we don't want to put the concept of accountability and transitional justice to be kind of a confrontation with the sovereignty and the nationalism. And a lot of people now trying to form new identity for themselves. And there's a level of patriotism in the country, but this needs to be a national dialogue. Unfortunately, victims are left alone in this fight with the civil society, which is the civil society under fire as well. That's why we get attacked online and smear campaigns about you're being out of the country, or you receive funding, or you said such things on such show. And this is to undermine and deteriorate the credibility of the civil society and to kind of strip the people from the experts who could be on their sides. Creating those gaps is in nobody's interest. Could Sharia repress everybody and say, this is what we have, take it or leave it? Yes, he could do that. Bashar al-Assad did that in 2000. He released the people, and if your family member was not released in 2000 from prison, you assume they're dead. Done. You don't ask, no questions, flip the page and move on. And Bashar managed to do that for the next 11 years till people exploded eventually. I'm hoping we're not going to repeat the same course of action.
Thank you. Perfect. Does anyone want to add anything to these questions before we open the floor for our,
Maybe end on a hopeful note, Maria.
Yeah. open the
I
floor
think
for
I'm,
questions.
I think I'm gonna agree with some of what Muhammad said, but maybe over to you, Noor, and then I can.
Sure, yeah, I won't say too much. I'll just start by saying that I fully agree with Mohammed and Anna, that dialogue is really important. One thing I heard a lot of people say, after the fall of the Assad regime is that Syrians are now getting to know each other for the first time. For the first time, we can talk, we can have conversations transparently without being worried that your neighbor is mukhabarat or secret, intelligence or anything like that. The other thing I would say is transparency is also really important, because previously, everything, you know, the civilians weren't involved in any of the government's decisions. They didn't have a role to play. And now there's an opportunity for them to have that. But what's been happening is that everything is happening under wraps. There's no kind of communicating openly. The decisions that they're making, it's all kind of happening secretly behind closed doors. And so there's no awareness of what's going through their minds when they make certain decisions. And so I think that transparency will be really key, because some of the sort of amnesties and things like that might be valid, but there's no, or it might be part of a certain process, but no one knows. And so I think that transparency is really key for legitimizing any of these steps. Yeah.
100%. I disagree with what Shara said from the Jordanian person, because Fadi Safar went back to the Damun where he committed the massacre. So it's not really that they really cared about people at the time. I think I can share an experience when I went to Syria in March this year. One of the points, again, I personally do not have trust in HTS, but also with any government whatsoever. I live in Germany, I'm in the US, both are supporting Israel, who's committing a genocide in Gaza as we speak, who's attacking Syria with Israelis airstrikes as we speak. So for me as a person, I really don't have that trust in governments and in politicians, let's put it that way. Nevertheless, I went to Syria and I was thinking, okay, this is happening now. The people are being killed because they are Alawis on the coast side. We know that. We've been hearing the reports from those people, no matter how much those were played with, the narrative was manipulated. We know that this would happen. Those cases were documented. We wanted to demonstrate in the street in Damascus. In the street in Damascus, and Muhammad knows more than me, this is not a possibility that you can have in Damascus to demonstrate against the government behavior about a certain and we said, so coming from outside, we want to ensure that, you know, we're doing the legal monitoring, we're making sure that if violations were committed, we want to know who committed those violations. But we also want to register the demonstration with the Syrian government, and we want them to ensure protecting this demonstration that we were having at the moment. And that we did. We had a demonstration. The Syrian government members did not attack us. We managed to stand in the streets and demonstrate against their behavior, their crimes on the coast. What I mean to say is that today I do not have a 100% trust.
Other demonstration attacked you though.
Yeah, other people in the streets attack us. And actually, this is,
I think that was staged, to be honest. That's my opinion. The government pushed those people to attack you.
and maybe not, but we got a registration of the demonstration, and that's something. I'm not saying that this is everything, but I know that this is possible. What I'm saying is that trust takes a long time to be established, especially with an armed group who was committing crimes in northwest Syria for years, especially, and this trust needs to come from their actions, what they're doing, as Noor said, transparency, as Anna said, inclusion, as Ahmad said, having all of these processes around survivors and victims of these crimes. And this will come with time. And then when they do a violation or a crime, those who are holding them civil society, don't detain them, don't disappear them, don't torture them. And I think those are the steps towards building this trust. And it's very important after 50 years of authoritarianism in Syria to build this trust with Syrians.
I really appreciate maybe wrapping up a very good summary on that conversation. So like what is essentially needed? How long does it take? And it's really a process building. Perfect. Thank you so much for this conversation. We can open right now the floor for any questions or comments from the attendees, first in person and then the online attendees. Yes, so. Yeah. And then so we know.
My name is Taha, visiting. Thank you for the great panel. So I have many questions for Anna Polina. I'll try to limit it to 3. So First question, you said, well, seemed like everything you talked about was not putting people in prison as part of the transitional justice. Is that like correct?
You want to ask three questions? And then-
Yes, so first question is, what was the harshest punishment, quote unquote, that was inflicted on anybody who committed a crime? Nobody went to prison, you know, what other tools were there to extract some sort of justice from those people? Second question I had is, now it's a decade later, 2025. Did people attitudes change in a positive or a negative way toward that experience? And, you know, sub question to that is the non-repetition part, was that successful, or were there some repetitions here and there? And the third question, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of the Colombian conflict is that it was more or less a stalemate after decades of civil war, and there was, you know, a very protracted negotiation process to reach a solution. And I think that's probably a major distinction between that and what happened in Syria, where one party basically completely vanquished the other major party. So I feel the incentive that HTS has to, you know, have a distributive justice and include themselves and other militias is probably not as much present as the Colombian case. So that might be something that could complicate, you know, replicating or doing an experience that is similar to Colombia. I don't know what you think about that. These are my two questions.
Okay, thank you for your questions. On the first one, it's not that, I mean, it is to some cases that are not crimes against humanity and war crimes, they are able to have restorative justice processes. So the ones that do have involved war crimes and crimes against humanity do not have alternative punishment. So in cases of alternative punishment, and as we can see, justice has been slow, we still have all of the cases open. We have some advances in the cases of kidnappings and the cases of forced disappearances, of extrajudicial executions. And what they have to do is that some of them have been in terms of building infrastructure or in terms of rural development projects. And as I say, they are still advancing in the process, so we still don't have one case that has been totally closed to have had the example of this is the punishment, the alternative punishment. So it depends on the crime that is being tried to see if there is a possibility of restorative justice or if they have to go to ordinary justice because it is not an amnesty possible. And in the second question, after almost 10 years, after signing the peace agreement, 9 years and 8 years of implementation, you asked about the non-repetition. So I would say that there are some crimes that will not repeat ever again. And I would say mainly we had a very horrible case of extrajudicial killings and how the military were given benefits for the number of guerrilla members that they killed. So what they did is that they kidnapped, they killed young men from rural areas or homeless people, and they dressed them as guerrilla members to say, we are winning the war, we have increased the number of elimination of the guerrilla members. And this was a well-known case. It was a horrible chapter in the history of our country, and it has been recognized by the perpetrators. Some of the military involved have said sorry. They are involved in the transitional justice mechanism. They were also tried in military courts. So this is a thing that I think that I can proudly say this horrible chapter in Colombia will never happen again. There are other abuses that are present in war and in conflict, and we still have some criminal groups that are present in the country. So other types of violence is happening today, but I would say that there are some crimes that will never be committed again, that are the thing of the extrajudicial killings. And the third question about the military stalemate, we did, since it was a long conflict and we were able to increase military pressure on the guerrilla, we were then able to get to the point of a stalemate where both the military and the state of Colombia and the FARC were able to say, let's get to a negotiation because it is the best possible solution to the conflict. And this, I want to mention that this differentiates from the case of Syria, because Syria is not only, we apply transitional justice in two scenarios, from a dictatorship to a democracy and from conflict to peace. And the case of Syria involves both.
Both, yeah.
So it is still more difficult because you have to have, for example, what happened in Chile and Argentina that were military dictatorships. They had to reform the security forces. In El Salvador, there was a peace agreement, but there was also a transition, and they had to dissolve the military, dissolve the police, and create a new national police. So this is gonna be more difficult for Syria because it was not an agreement where the guerrilla members or the perpetrators from all sides of the conflict agreed to start this transitional justice process, but it is gonna be what will happen to the military. How do you rebuild the judicial system, as Mohammed said? And I think that that would be the main, also the one, like an additional challenge for Syria in comparison to Colombia.
Okay, should we go with the, yes, please, and then, thank you,
Thank you. Khalid Lebed from George Washington University.
thank you.
It's a more general question addressed to the whole panel. Thank you for all your insights. In my humble opinion, success of transitional justice process is very much dependent on political and institutional reform, and especially political will. My question is really directed towards the future. How do you see this as a possibility for the future of Syria? Thank you.
The panelists would like to take that question about the future.
I can quickly. So I think best case scenario, Syria will emerge from this and hopefully good governance and good practices, learning from the mistakes of the neighbors, etc. But even that best case scenario is something, no offense to the Lebanese, I'm half Lebanese, by the way. My mom was from Lebanon, but something similar to Lebanon or Iraq, kind of combination between both. Kind of you get the elite cronies living their life in the green zone of the city, and they have their own problems between the leadership of the political leadership, and the leadership of the civil society and their media gang, and creating their bubbles and fights and disputes and everything, and everybody else in misery, literally, in the country. Or to the even worst version where Iraq is militia government backed by some regional powers. In Iraq, the case is Iran kept supporting al-Maliki's government for the first 15 years of toppling Saddam Hussein, and that could happen. Like we get armed groups governing the country supported by regional powers, and this time with international recognition. And that's a question where the political will is important. Now, after the meeting Shara had with Trump, lifting the sanctions, where that will be interpreted, how that will be cashed in day-to-day basis. Like, are they going to say, like, listen, we got international recognition, amazing, let's do something great, and we earned it, okay? Like, let's do this. Or like, we got the international recognition, screw them, we're not going to do anything of the good governance things they want. And I worry, so far in the last 7 months, they're doing that. Like, yeah, Shara appointed his own brothers. Like, if you have a brother named Maher, you never bring him to the state in Syria, because after Maher al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad, like, if you have a brother named Maher, send him out of the country. Yeah, and now he brought Maher al-Shara to be the chief of staff in the presidential palace. He brought his brother Hazem to be the chief of the Investment National Commission. His other brother, in no capacity, is doing business with former Iranian militia-backed groups and Pentagon drug dealers. And then the mayor of Damascus, or the governor of Damascus, is the in-law of Shara. The head of the ports and customs enforcement is the brother of his wife. Or the other. Yeah, it's bad. If it continues this way, I don't think we're going, even Lebanon or Iraq will be luxury to look at. Like, we might go to something like, again, I have no offense, but I'm happy Lebanese. My mom is Lebanese.
So I.
But this is where a political will is problematic issue. If there's no will of the authority to do so, the tools you have in your hand is to mobilize the street. And people in Syria are really, really exhausted. And now they're drained. They just want to focus on a little bit more power, electricity, a little bit more food, a little bit higher salary. And this is being unfortunately mispresented, unfortunately by some elites writing about this, Well, people don't want freedom, they want bread and electricity. Like, we had bread and electricity in 2010, and people talked to the streets, so it wasn't about food. Yes, today's immediate need in the survival mode is feeding people, but give them 6 months after you improve the economic situation, they're gonna demand everything. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Yes, I want to go to the second row of the lady and then the substance, please. So go ahead. Did I miss anyone? Perfect. Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking here today. My name is Laura. I'm a student at the Elliott School of International Affairs, and I also work for the Kurdish Peace Institute. I have a bunch of questions, mostly regarding the SNA. Well, first of all, how is the reintegration process looking like for sanctioned SNA leaders? There is a very big lack of trust, like specifically in the Northeast. Some of them are still like given leadership positions there. They still like retain their power. What's being done regarding that? And also, I guess my second part of my question would be about like the foreign fighters that are currently a part of those militias. What is happening to them? What does it look like right now?
Is anyone, Mariana? Oh,
I can speak about the
Thank
NSA,
you.
since I've worked on investigating their crimes in Bahrain, last year. And it's horrible to see Abu Hamsha standing and talking to Syrians about the future and how he perceives it. And I think that and especially with the Syrian National Army, with the crimes that were committed not only against Kurds, but also in the whole region, there was a strategic decision to move them from one area to another in Syria, which was, I think, at least to me, was an important decision. Nevertheless, we need to see them persecuted for the crimes that they've committed. But I think it goes back to the amnesty questions, goes back to people being granted amnesties, people who were already a part of different militias being reintegrated. We know that those people are now celebrating their presence in Syria, being celebrated by certain individuals in Syria, and this can be 100% triggering and also worrying and scaring for a lot of people, Kurds specifically, who crimes were committed against. That said, I do not necessarily see any de-integration of those individuals as we speak. I see them there, and I don't see any behavior of the government with excluding them anymore soon. Same with the foreign fighters. It was very interesting to see with the Shara's meeting with Macron, talking about answering to the question of foreign fighters and talking about women, Syrian women having citizenships and being able to give the citizenship to their children or to their relatives. Such an interesting conversation, because Syrian women have been fighting for this right for years. And if this was at any moment granted because we want to normalize foreign fighters or give them Syrian citizenship to stay in the country, that's really worrying. A lot of detention cases that have been reported to us in the recent month, like 1 month from now, foreign fighters were included and involved in these detention cases, and they were involved also in the torturing of these individuals, or at least the alleged torturing, since we did not conduct kind of thorough investigations into these cases. That's also worrying. So that would be my answer to this, but I'm not sure if anyone would like to say anything else.
thank you so much. I think, yes, and then we go to the back. Thank you. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out to talk to us. My name is Noor, and I'm a student. I'm a master's student here at Elliott, and my question is directed toward Mr. Abdullah, and anybody else who would like to offer their expert opinion. You mentioned that the French are providing their legal and technical expertise to write the constitution and rebuild the Syrian legal infrastructure. But as the previous colonizer of Syria, and the reason why we are in the state that we are in is France. Like, I'm just gonna put it simply. So it's, to me, it seems counterintuitive. It'd be like going to the Russians for expertise and legal advice. So my question is, why are they involved in this process? And is there like a consensus amongst the people? My other question is, the new constitution. So does the 1953 constitution have any parts to do with being applied to the new constitution. So,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay, quickly, France has not started, but they are offering their support to build the judiciary, train prosecutors and judges, which is, given we talk their law, and this is a reality, I don't see much harm in doing the training if the training is about more capacity building, the rule of law, due processes, and upholding the law, right? It's not the political. Now, Syria is in a vacuum, and there's a competition of power. Clearly, you have the Saudis showing up heavily in Syria, the Turks as well, and the competition, the Israelis on the side. So this is going to be a regional competition between, and France wanted a piece of that influence in Lebanon and in Syria, clearly, and that's why the French were the first to host Sharia in Europe. I don't see necessarily a harm of doing the training itself. It's just how much actual influence anybody will have over the process in Syria. Is the judiciary will be independent? Are they going to influence the transitional justice process positively or negatively at all? Again, I worry about bringing international pressure on the government in Syria for this case, because that will equate it with interventions. Like, hey, you're bringing the internationals on us on this issue, and it needs to be organic, right, people? And this goes to your second point about the consensus among the people. I'm sorry for my language, but in Syria, screw the people who asks. Like, nobody cares. And that's what the authority has been doing, And from Assad, the father, to the second Assad, and now the transitioning authorities, the people are not being asked about their opinion or about their support. Now, everybody want the transition to be smooth. They want it to be successful. So they're honestly more or less looking the other way when they see wrongdoings. Just they want to give the benefit of the doubt to the authorities. They want them to, okay, we'll take it in goodwill. We'll let you do this. We'll give you 6 months. We'll give you a year. We'll give you etc. And step after step, you see the authorities taking that for granted. The confidence of the people. And unfortunately, being in a heavily armed group themselves, HTS, any confrontation with the public, I don't think is going to be dealt with other than lethal force. And that scares me. Like, we don't want to repeat the bloodbath we've seen before. The 1953 Constitution, Bashar Assad did the 2012 Constitution, which is, he changed the 1953 Constitution, put more power to himself on the 2012 Constitution. Now, the Constitutional Declaration gives Sharia, like, all the powers, more or less. But then there's different statements like, the old constitution applies except for the constitutional declaration articles that has over, like, basically it takes over in certain clauses, but it's not clear where the things. And that constitution, again, was not voted, there's no referendum, there's nothing. It's just Sharia appointed 7 people. A lot of them, they're legally credentialed and their academic credentials were questionable because they were not actually truly graduate. He just put people, give them the framework, what he wants to do, and they give him that. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just for time purposes, the attendee on the back, then
Ziara Davis. I'm an intern with Syria Justice and Accountability Center from the University of Michigan, doing the Eastern Studies and International Security. So my question is, do you think transitional justice in Syria should involve foreign parties that were involved in the Syrian conflict? Like, you have the Iran, Hezbollah, like Russia even, especially when it comes to Lebanon. Like, Lebanon and Syria are neighbors. Eventually they will have economic, cultural, social interests. Like, how do you move on in your relationship with this country when you have Hezbollah was involved in the conflict? There's a lot of tension and hatred. My second question is, how can transitional justice be possible when the current government has incorporated many former Al-Qaeda foreign fighters into the military? So,
thank you. You can just leave.
Others can answer this question, but in general, I think yes, accountability and justice at large should include all the actors. Not necessarily we'll be able to put Putin on trial in Syria, although his air force has killed a lot of Syrians. Unfortunately, this is the truth with videos. But he's facing charges by ICC for Ukraine as well, right? But there are other elements where the state should engage those actors about apology, about reparation, about returning of assets. Russia holds a lot of Syrian national assets now with Assad. Assad shipped a lot of the money to the central bank, and a lot of the assets estimated by Reuters $900 million of cash only, let alone gold and diamonds and all that. So there should be engagement. Usually the Syrians pick up in the Russia and the Iran issue when both countries bring up their the debt, the Syrian debt to them, because the Syrian state has been borrowing money from both states. And now we not only they killed a lot of Syrians, we have to pay them for that, like because we borrowed a lot of money from them, which is between 30 to 50 billion dollars of debt. Like, as that could be reclassed or could be waived, could be like, we don't know. That there's a process there. But even Russia still have their air bases in Syria. And this is again another point Noor couldn't emphasize enough, is the transparency. Like, where the relation with the Russians? Are they staying? Are they leaving? Are we allowing them? Is this military presence now? The US military presence in northeast Syria has not been legal since the defeat of ISIS, because that was under the mandate of Security Council resolution for combating terrorism. But after that, it lacks adequate legal justification. Now the Syrian state want to sign a deal with Trump to allow him. It's like, I worry the Syrian state is taking legitimacy, the authorities, from the international relations more than the people in Syria. And that's, yes, you will get all the states pleased, but the Syrian people angry. That's Al-Qaeda question is a very tough one, honestly. I don't know how integrating Qaeda members will be possible, and how much people will de-radicalize openly and honestly are there disrobing with their past and their ideology. I don't know. The reality to that is questionable, and bringing them to the Ministry of Defense is problematic.
That it is better for like security reasons to include them or like abandon them?
Yeah, this is the argument Shara presented to the Americans simply. If we integrate them to the military, it's better than actually trying to get rid of them, because there will be more threat if we try to get rid of them. I think Shara is using them as personal guards for him, and that's the reality.
Thank you so much. We're gonna go through some of the questions from the online attendees, and so we can be on time in wrapping the panel. Thank you.
How will the lifting of sanctions impact the possibility of a thorough transitional justice process? Was it premature, and could the possibility of lifting sanctions have been used to push the new leaders towards conducting a more thorough process?
Anyone would like to talk about the transitional justice and sanctions lifting?
I mean, I guess I can speak briefly on that. I mean, this question of whether or not sanctions could have served as pressuring existing authorities to develop a more thorough transitional justice process is definitely one that's been up for discussion. I think I think there's one thing that I think I'm noticing, and others on this panel I have likely also noticed, is just how rushed everything is. They're rushing to try to get things up to speed and try to move things forward, and that is resulting in a lack of transparency, a lack of trust, a lack of due process. And so I think to a certain extent, delaying the lifting of sanctions could have contributed to that. That said, I think there are a couple of issues with that. One is just the need for lifting sanctions will help the countries economically develop much more quickly with sanctions being gone. And then the second thing is the point that was emphasized a couple of times, which is that we don't want foreign pressure to be dictating how transitional justice looks. We want that to be coming from inside the country. And so those are a couple of points. My concern around the sanctions being lifted is that many of the sanctioned individuals were ones who were some of these businessmen who are very close to the Assad regime. And so my concern is that this creates lots of room for them to engage in business outside of Syria with foreign companies, and really just kind of get off scot-free and be able to make lots and lots more money. And so to me, that is a barrier to the transitional justice process, but there is a role to be played, at least internally in Syria, that at least up until now has not been played with holding those companies accountable. And so, yeah, that's what I'll say on that.
Thank you. We have
One more.
one more question. Thank you.
Final question is about refugees and internally displaced persons. What sort of work is proceeding to bring them home, and what sort of support can they expect from the new Syrian government, from Syrian civil society, and from international organizations?
That's a very good question. I want to just add to it when it comes to Lebanon, right? Like, how do you guys see Lebanon role with the refugees? Because there is also a conversation about Lebanon and when it comes to refugees displacements. So if anyone would like to talk about the refugees process.
Yeah, I think quickly, because we're engaging with the EU Asylum Agency.
Yes.
And
Perfect.
we don't think the Syria state is ready to receive people. Any return, especially forced return, will be non-voluntary, non-dignified, and non-safe. Syria is not safe, not necessarily you will land in Syria and be detained by the intelligence tomorrow, no, but there are high level of crimes, there's militias roaming in different areas, depends where you belong to. Are you from the Homs, Hama, from Latakia, from Damascus, etc. And also there's no economic opportunity for a lot of the people in the country. So is it dignified? No. Most of the country is leveled. And yes, we've seen a couple of IDP camps being emptied and people relocated to their towns, except actually they brought their tents with them and they put their tents in their own towns. So they were not actually relocating to homes. They moved their camps to the area where they grew up with the hope they will rebuild their homes. I think unfortunately the Europeans are in a hurry and a rush to send refugees back. And part of the, if you want to call it premature recognition of Sharia, so you know what? Yeah, it's good. Take him. Here's. And I think part of the dynamics happening, especially in Germany, is how much we spend on the refugees every year, couple of $1 billion, couple of billion euros. Okay, take the money, build your country, or take the people with you. And that's problematic. Up to today, it has been discussed to give one visit permit to every refugee to go and check on their home and their neighborhood. Is it livable condition or no? That has not been passed as a law. And everybody is scared. Yes, it's being talked about by politicians, but if it's not a law, if you go and you come back, the refugee agencies or the immigration court might get you on that and send you back to Syria. Iraqi refugees were pushed in a very inhumane way from Germany, where the German government did a deal with the Iraqi government. So we give you 4,000 euros for every family you relocate back to Iraq. And of course, Maliki didn't give a dime to the families who were returned. Of course, they cut their aid inside Germany. And if you lose your work authorization and benefits and healthcare, eventually you have children, you have to pack and go home. And the Iraqi government is not going to welcome you with anything, just you're on your own. That's bad. And that's why we see a very, like the number of people returned is a good sign, but people want to go back to Syria, but it's very limited or little comparing to the overall number of refugees. I think it's going to take a couple of years for those people to be reintegrated in the country in a meaningful way. And unfortunately, all the programs in the EU, there were some like the safe zones inside Syria. And the conversation started even before Assad collapsed. Like, is Northeast Syria safe because the American forces are there? Yes. Let's deport Syrians there. And we pushed very hard against this. And thankfully, the European Court for Human Rights and the European Justice Court both decided, not Syria cases, but the jurisdiction or the jurisprudence applied to Syria as well. It was Latvia case, a Latvian refugee, I think in Sweden. And there's his area is safe, we return him, and the European Court of Justice said there's no such safe zones, either a safe country or not a safe country. There's several cases Cyprus lost to Syrian refugees who were deported back to Lebanon. And all these cases are important to say there's legal norms today that we cannot deport people, except the Europeans, and this goes back to Mariana's comment, everybody is walking back from international law. Everybody is walking back from what they signed up to. Everybody is looking the other way when crimes being committed. And if you look at the UK deal with Rwanda to send refugees to Rwanda, the UK proposed the law, and then the Constitutional Court in the UK said it's illegal. They revised the law and they pushed it, and the Constitutional Court shut up. But the European Court of Justice said this is a bad law, and it's illegal. And the UK threatened to withdraw from the European Court of Justice if they strike down the law again. Okay, the whole order of international law and the post-World War II is up to question now. And Gaza is not the only example. Gaza and Syria and Ukraine, and like you get a lot of conflicts. And that's why maybe we should find other jobs. I don't know.
Maybe we should.
On a positive note, I think, and honestly, the truth is a lot of people are pushing back on this. We try to take up cases in Europe to defend refugees. I'm trying to do it here with ICE. There's some Syrians in ICE custody. We're trying to argue back. This is problematic. You cannot deport them. The number of people volunteering to do this work pro bono is amazing. And that gives hope a little bit. And you could always push back, but the right-wing rise in Europe is scary.
Right. I want to thank everyone who attended the panel in person and online. I want to thank the New Lines Institute, the Center for Middle East Studies, and Hukukiyat for the work. Thank you very much for attending. And yeah, please enjoy some